Good morning. I'm Phil He. I'm Senior Vice Chancellor of Academic Fair. It's always wonderful to see us together in this room, and especially a beautiful Friday. And we have a wonderful guest today. Before I introduce Paul, I'll share with you that university has great momentum. And thanks to all faculty and staff, we have been doing fantastic work in the last few years. I came here last January, if you recall, so this marks my year and a half here, back in my alma mater. And for Paul's knowledge, I was a graduate student here in 1994, graduate in 1997, so I was the first PhD grad from the inaugural criminal justice PhD program. So it's wonderful to be back here to serve in a Chief Academic Affairs role. So JNAT topic for today, we have a national expert here today. I came in here last year trying to move fast, faster than I should have. And you told me, slow down, let's do the best job. The ringleader, the Faculty Senate President, who I met on very frequent basis in the last year and a half. I've learned so much from you, William. I respect the faculty. I respect our collective wisdom to do the right thing with the right timing and with the right tempo. So we did that 2 days ago. Actually, yesterday, was it yesterday or 2 days ago? Faculty Senate voted on and passed the JNAT reform proposal. So I think so it's a beautiful timing that we have a national expert joining us today to talk about JNAT. Last time when HLC Vice President Tom Bodenkircher visited UNO, he kind of half-joked. I asked him how long did it take for Ohio University, not the Ohio University to go through their JNAT reform. And I thought he was serious. He said 40 years. And he said you need to learn from them. Okay, I still intend to connect with my counterpart from Ohio University, learn about their experience. But we did not take 40 years. And we have a very good proposal, and thanks to Matt, thanks for your leadership, and for the participation leadership from the JNAT committee, from the Faculty Senate. Real work just started. I believe you'll learn a great deal today, and I just asked Paul that I hope this is a long-term relationship, and our institution and us as peers, as colleagues, to learn from each other. We have so much to talk about. But I want to introduce to you who Paul is. Maybe, Paul, you don't need introduction with this book right here, but I do. So Dr. Paul Hanstedt is currently the Vice Chancellor for Academic Fair and Innovation. This is a very innovative title, I can tell you that, at University of Minnesota, Rochester. He previously led the Houston Hart Center for Teaching and Learning at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. He received his doctorate in literature from The Ohio State University, master's in creative writing from Iowa State University, and bachelor's in literature from Luther College. So Paul knows Midwest pretty well. Paul is a nationally recognized leader in teaching and learning innovation, including his book, Creating Wicked Students, Designing Courses for Complex World, which is right here, a copy to share with you. Thank you for your generosity. And JNAT Essentials, a guide for college faculty, and many, many essays, one of which I really enjoy reading. That is, it's time to get rid of distribution requirement. So a little bit history behind it, and I came the last 20 years, I spent the last 20 years of my career at Northeastern University, and JNAT was something they looked at it too. That university wanted to be innovative. That university was founded in 1898. We were funded in 1908. And then our JNAT model was imported from Chicago, University of Chicago-based model. And from time to time, we do make update, do make change. And our faculty, you told each other, it's time for us to do something, to update our JNAT curriculum, to be more purposeful, to allow our students to have the competency to compete successfully, to live as productive citizens, to have a resilient career, they need not only a degree, a major, and taking courses, but learning the fundamental skills. And we have done a lot of work. I really give kudos to everyone's effort in getting us to this stage. So I wanted to make sure that my commitment is here, firm commitment. GenEd proposal is passed. It's just the first step. The White's Innovation Fund has funded the GenEd project going forward. So you have funding. This is $1.5 million for the first year. GenEd is a part of that funding. And GenEd is a multi-year funding proposal that was funded. Even if that funding runs out, my office will continue to support it. So we want to make sure for faculty, our understanding it's a long haul, it's work in progress. We'll continue to taking your input to make the GenEd as strong as possible. And frankly, we want to be that role model for Urban Metropolitan University, which we are a part of. And we have volunteered ourselves to use GenEd as our quality improvement project for HLC. So they will be keeping a very close eye on us. We will be providing update to HLC. So I look forward to your work, look forward to Paul's lecture today, and look forward to continued conversation. Thank you for your support. Thank you. Paul?
I love that they, oh. Can you hear me? Can we hear? Yeah, it's okay, good. I love that the chairs are up here because it means I got to stay awake, right? But we can count how many times I trip over them. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. The Vice Chancellor mentioned that I went to Luther College as an undergraduate. Someone asked me, had I ever been here before? And I had in, let's hypothetically say, the 1980s for a concert by the Welsh band, The Alarm. I don't know if anybody does alternative music, right? Yeah, it's a great concert. I remember it. It's nice to be back. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. And I'm a little worried about that, but I'll try to sort of keep the pace reasonable. And if we end up having to cut some corners towards the end, that's not the end of the world. There is the conversation this afternoon as well. Want to talk about trends in general education. Want to talk about rationales for those trends. And then I want to think about structurally, what does this look like? Some of this, given that your new curriculum just passed yesterday, some of it's going to be a little irrelevant or redundant. I'm not going to overly worry about that because the way I see my job here is to sort of come in and talk about the possible. I work very hard not to be prescriptive. I think this is something like my 80th campus visit. And then I've done some work at institutes, there's a couple hundred additional places. I'm not in the business of sort of telling people what they need to do. You know your institution, you know your mission, you know your students, you know who you are as instructors and as departments. So your job is to translate, okay? That in mind, I always begin with this quote by Jerry Gaff. A program for reforming general education should be designed around each institution's character, the strengths and interests of its faculty, and the needs of its students. One correction I would do is I would reverse the order of students and faculty. Just sort of put that out there that finally we need to make sure that we're serving the students where they are at. I begin with this quote every single presentation I do, and I do that for a number of different reasons. One is just the flat out message here. You're not about, Gen Ed is not about an institution looking and going, well, what does Harvard do? What does Stanford do? I'm at University of Minnesota, Rochester. We do not have Harvard and Stanford students. I like our students a lot. I prefer them probably to Harvard and Stanford students, but we need to serve that population. And I need to work with the faculty that I have. The other reason, and it just is to also kind of foreground that point again that I'm not here to prescribe, I'm here to describe and give you a sense of sort of broad sense of what's possible and what can happen. And then third, I like to point to that date at the bottom, okay? I was a faculty member for 23 years before I started to run a Center for Teaching and Learning. This gig as an administrator, I'm still getting used to that thing where like somebody asks a question and everybody turns and looks at me and I'm like, oh wait, I don't want to decide this, right? So it's an unfamiliar role to me. As a faculty member, we've seen this, right? People come in and go, well, here's a hot new thing. You got to do this. Well, if you're not doing this, you're gonna get behind. Remember MOOCs? Right? So there's just this thing where we get fatigued, right? And I want to emphasize the point that the conversation we're having now is not me standing up and saying, here's my new trend and you should buy my product. It's me at the end of a long train of very thoughtful conversations that's been going on for over 40 years, okay? And just wanted to kind of ground that. All right, so talking a little bit about trends, generally speaking, in general education. If you take all of the curricular gen ed models in the world, and we are finding gen ed increasingly in Asia and in Europe, you're going to find the thing on the left, if you put them on a continuum, the thing on the left is going to look very familiar to most of us who came up through a distribution model. You take 2 of this and 2 of this and 2 of this, and then you're perfectly prepared for the rest of the world, except you're not. On the other side, what you're going to find is what I refer to as integrative models. And what an integrative model is it's a model that takes the way all of our fields are already interdisciplinary and foregrounds it. So let me give you an example. I've got integrative courses there and interdisciplinary courses. I think of an interdisciplinary course as something like this: politics and art. And you can make a class called politics and art, and there's a logic to that. Politics influences art. Art influences politics. Most political science professors could teach that. Most of them see it as an add-on to the work that they do. They're going to have to learn something about art that they hadn't. And most art professors, same thing. They could teach it, but they would see the politics side as a little bit of an add-on. So that's interdisciplinary. You take 2 things and you put them together. It can be done very well. It can be done in very meaningful ways. An integrative course, though, is something more like this. You take the pieces that are already interdisciplinary within a field and you foreground it. So I'll use my own field of Victorian literature as an example. In order to teach 19th century British Victorian literature, I have to teach history. I have to teach sociology because there were social movements going on. I have to teach economics because economics came into play, and this is when unions started to form. I have to teach gender studies because the Seneca Falls Convention was in 1848, and that changed everything. I have to talk about education and public policy because increasingly over the course of that era, more and more people had access to education, more and more people could read, and that influenced what writers did. I have to talk about Darwin and geology and changing understandings of the age of the world and the impact that that had on religion and the impact that that had on society. So all those things are already there. When I'm teaching a Victorian literature class, those things are in the background. I bring them in to inform the reading of the literature. In an integrative course, where I'm teaching non-majors in general education, I had a course called Artistic and Literary Responses to Science and Technology. I foreground those things. Those elements of the course that, in my mind, inform my field become the entrance, the doorways in for people from different fields. And oftentimes they become part of the feature of the work that they do as they're studying this literature. It's not just here's literature for the understanding of literature. Here's literature, and it's talking about what it means to be a scientist, right? I had a guest professor come in once, and he taught Edgar Allan Poe's Ode to Science, which is a rip on science. And he turned to the scientists in the room and said, who studies science here? A bunch of people raised their hands. He goes, is this how you see your field? And they're like, no. And then they responded. So it becomes the invitation in. It becomes a way of students to connect the field that they're studying in the distribution model in a meaningful way. Another way to look at this, Gen Ed 1.0 says you got these 3 things, you learn them because they're good for you. Breadth, because everybody wakes up in the morning and goes, I want to be well-rounded. That's what really motivates me, right? I'm joking. Gen Ed 2.0, integrative model, says, yeah, you have those things, but the emphasis is on connecting them, on exploring what the sciences do, and then thinking about how that is or isn't related to what they do in literary fields. And if you think that sounds bizarre, I can talk about geology and reading Middlemarch and how they are both working with large data sets and struggling to find meaning. okay? But in addition, integrative courses connect to the world around us. You know, your career goals as a student, your spiritual life, your political life, your family life, anime, how you spend your time online, media, all of these things. And it's not just leaving it there, oh, you know, study biology because it's good for you, or study literature because it's good for you. It's bringing it in explicitly and carefully and deliberately as a means of making sense, making meaning. For me, this is so distinctive, I don't even like to call it general education anymore. General education implies generality. This is more in-depth, more focused, and it has a different purpose. And you have got to be kidding me. My battery just died. That is insane. Big climactic moment, and it got blown. So, this is, I move away from the term general education at that point. And I know there's a problem with that because my book is called General Education Essentials. I didn't name it, that was my editor. I like liberal education because it derives from liberal arts, which derives from the Latin ars liberalis. And the point behind ars liberalis is it's the arts by which a person is freed. So general education is giving you a general introduction to these fields. Liberal education is giving you the skills you need to enter the world. Thank you so much. That's the quickest response I've ever had in my life. Liberal education, ars liberalis, is giving you the skills you need to move into the world with agency, so that when you encounter something you haven't seen before, or your career turns out not to be what you thought it was going to be, or the world changes so quickly that your career changes in ways you hadn't anticipated, you're not stuck. You have options, you have agency, you have the cognitive ability to look at the situation, metacognitively, to think about what you can do and to approach it. You're not trapped in the structures that are predefined. Going back to our continuum, this is from 2016. It's a little dated, but it's worth noting. If you, in surveys by the AAC and U, what they find is about 15% of models are purely distribution. About 18% of models have some integrative features in there pretty predominantly, and about 64% blend the two pretty solidly. The movement, generally speaking, is away from pure distribution models to more integrative models. Maybe not necessarily the far right-hand side, but definitely away from that pure distribution component. Here's why that trend is happening. I'm going to give you 4 rationales at this point. Sometimes I give 4 different rationales. I think in the second edition of the book, I've got like 6 rationales, which are different than the 4 rationales in the first edition of the book. Paul Gaston, who's a professor emeritus, I want to say from Notre Dame, he has 7 rationales. These are the 4 I'm giving you now, okay, at this moment in time. I'll talk about each in turn. Wicked problems. I countered the concept of wicked problems when I was working in Hong Kong on gen ed reform. I met an engineer named Edmund Coe. He was Stanford educated, then at Carnegie Mellon for a long career. I met him at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And he talked about these problems as engineers encountered when they left the undergraduate degree, where they went into the world and they were seeing dynamic problems. Problems where the parameters were constantly shifting, constantly changing. So what the problem looked like on Monday would be different than what the problem looked like on Friday, or what the problem looked like in February would be different than what the problem looked like in September. So it's shifting constantly, it's unpredictable. They are resistant, wicked problems, to previous solutions, previous ways of doing things. In fact, not uncommonly, wicked problems can't be completely solved. Sometimes the data that we have is incomplete. Sometimes the data that we have is contradictory, but we still have to act because these have urgency. These problems need to be addressed. Sometimes they're hard to recognize as well. Sometimes with the data, there's competing interests and pressures and ways of thinking about it. Some people are saying, well, here's what you need to do. And other people are saying, no, here's what you need to do. Sometimes people are saying, this is a huge problem, we need to address it. And other people are saying, no, it's not. So you've got all this contradiction, all this fluidity, all this shift, all this uncertainty. And the solutions draw from multiple areas. And of course, this is where wicked problems come into play with general education. I'll use the example of COVID. If COVID had been purely a STEM problem, we would have been out of the weeds in about 15 months. But economics came into play, politics came into play, sociology came into play, religion came into play, communication came into play. All these features were impacting our ability to deal with and address the issue. Some examples of wicked problems: climate change. You know, climate change is an interesting one because we actually know what we need to do, but getting it to work politically, getting it to work economically with developed nations and less developed nations is hard. Poverty, immigration, AI. I just added AI last week. There we go. Because every time I turn around, it's like, what? Wait, what? No. You know. At first, I was like, AI can't write like human beings, and well, now it can. COVID is an excellent example, not just because it's multidisciplinary, but because think about what it was like. You know, in March of 2020, we thought 2 weeks. Biologists were like, no. And then we got the vaccinations. We thought, okay, great. Sociologists are like, no. So it's just this kind of continual curve that we're on where we keep waiting to kind of arrive and know where we are. It took a long time. And we still haven't solved it completely. Education is a wicked problem. And that's funny because I like to think about education as a solution, right? And it is. But think about things like, I mean, even on a micro level, you teach your 9 o'clock class and it's brilliant, the best class you've ever taught. And then you teach it again at 11 o'clock, you're like, what? And it's because we can't control the dynamics of the classroom. You've got different people in there and it's shifting and different concerns and different ideas. But also on a macro level, why did you just have a big conversation about how to revise your general education? Because the needs of our students and the students that we have don't look like the students we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly not 30 years ago. Reason number 2 for a shift towards more integrative models. So wicked problems force us to go into more integrative models because it becomes less about know this field, know this field, know this field, and more about how do you respond to a shifting dynamic. What can you draw from a variety of different fields? It changes why we want them to know and work with, and how we want them to work with a lot of different fields. Second reason for a move towards integrative models, career as journey. This is how a lot of students envision their careers. I've got a 17-year-old right now, and he's like, I'm going to go into cybersecurity. And he wants to go, so he picked the best cybersecurity school in the country, and we're like, you know, 80% of the students changed their mind by the end of their first year. And then even if you don't change your mind, this is what careers really look like. I mean, I'm standing up here talking to you about general education. I'm an administrator at a pre-health sciences university. My degree is in literature, for God's sakes. Even in academia, things shift, dynamics shift, because sometimes students don't get the jobs they want, or sometimes they don't even go into the fields that they study. You know, they spend 4 years doing marketing or zoology, and then they go into marketing. That's my friend Kate. Sometimes they don't stay in the fields that they start in. The attrition in teaching is something like 50% in the first 3 years. Nursing is not much better. And these are highly mission-driven students when they come in. This is what they've always wanted to do. And then they get out there and they're like, it's not what I thought it was. If we've done a good job, even if they go into the fields that they study and stay in those fields, the challenges they're going to face are going to be shifting constantly. So I've got a friend, Kurt, who was an architect. When he first got hired, he was drafting. And then he got promoted, and suddenly he was meeting with customers, clients. And then he got promoted again, and suddenly he was on zoning boards in the city and working with folks in the town. And then he got promoted again, and suddenly he's in charge of hiring and firing within the firm. And then he got promoted again, and he's a partner now, and so he has to deal with mission and long-term planning. An integrative approach recognizes the wickedness, the complexity, the dynamic qualities of the world that we're facing, and prepares students not for one thing, a narrow path, but to be able to respond and to pivot and to adjust to the moment, okay? So not just the things you study, but how you move between the various fields and courses that you take. Finally, this, You know, we are so set in our world. And that's not the world 95% of our students are going to face. They're going to go, my dad's a Lutheran minister, you know. Religion was the smallest portion of what he did during his week. He would preach on Sundays, and that's when the theology came into play. But even that was oral presentation skills. During the week, he was doing counseling, he was doing management, he was doing HR, he was doing community outreach. Just all these things blur together in ways that oftentimes for us, they don't. Third idea for a move towards integrative approaches, a meaningful education. I'm an English professor, so after a couple times of doing this, I highlighted the full with the extra L in yellow so people would know I knew how to spell. But we lose sight of this idea, right? That meaningful actually comes from the idea of full of meaning, full of purpose. This is an image from the Hong Kong Institute of Education. The caption below this was "My teacher." Obviously, it's an image of a tree. What's distinctive to me about this is also obviously a tree that is made up of all the fragments and pieces of what it is to be a teacher. So you've got, you know, the music and sports and, you know, science and chemistry, arts. I assume this is a martini glass, which during the pandemic was huge for teachers. But the point here is, our students live in complicated, fragmented worlds. You know, just within academia, they've got their major courses, their minor courses, their concentration courses, they've got their gen ed courses, they've got the courses they take for the major that they think they want to have, and then realize it's not. And then they've got their friends in their dorm, and they've got their friends in their major, and then they've got their friends in their clubs, and they've got their friends at home. I mean, you know, back in the 1850s, when I was a student, you didn't get in touch with your high school friends but twice a year. Now, hourly, right? So, and they've got their parents, and all these influences and all this information is flying at them constantly. And so the point is, where do we give them a chance to take those pieces and put them together in a meaningful way? To think, okay, what does it mean to be a scientist? What does it mean for me to be a scientist? What do I want in life? What do I value and care about in life? I've got a friend, Rich Grant, who's a physicist. He says it's like life is full of all these puzzle pieces that our students gather from their parents, from their friends, from the society, from social media. And they come to college and they want to make sense of it. And all we do is throw more puzzle pieces into the box. So where do we give them time to put the pieces together? And an integrative model pays attention to that. Finally, equity, inclusion, and justice. I like this image so much I use it twice. I've got a son who went to Grinnell College. They don't have a gen ed curriculum. Little irony there, his dad writes about and works with people in gen ed curriculum. Fact of the matter is, he gets to Grinnell and he's fine, because he knows why these things matter. So he's studying physics, but he's taking philosophy classes and he's taking education classes. He's got that insider knowledge. This kid, he's going to be fine. Other of our students come and they've got these requirements and they don't know why they're taking them, and they don't know how they should choose these pieces, and they don't know why these pieces matter or the huge impact that these pieces are going to have on them in their lives. UMR, where I work now, is 67% historically and structurally marginalized students. We have general education built into our curriculum. 60% of our students come in thinking they want to be doctors, and they don't know why the hell they should have to take a philosophy class. You're like, oh my God, really? You know. So how do we, an integrative model foregrounds this. It makes it explicit. This is another image for how some of our students are. It helps students understand not just what they need to take, but why they need to take it. You know, how do we, if some of the students are like my son and they get it and others don't, how is that fair? How is that equitable? And how do we make sure that it's fair and equitable for everybody, that they can decode what's going on? How do we make sure that everybody has access to ethics, because, oh my goodness, we kind of need that now? To information literacy, because, oh my goodness, we need that now desperately? To thinking about AI, literacies and competencies. I know that you all have a new major That's excellent. I'm going to come back and I'm going to look at that. I want to know more about that. Viewpoints different from their own in this day and age. Empathy and humility. The ability to interact with people who are less fortunate with them or to understand where someone else is coming from. All right. So those are the rationales for why we're moving towards more integrative models. Here are some of the models I'm going to give you. Oh, first, I already mentioned this, but I'm going to do it again. I'm going to show you some models. I'm going to show you some approaches in the classroom. I'm going to show you some assignments. Some of you may look at them and go, ooh, that's cool, I want to do that. Others are going to look and go, no way, English professor, dude, what do you think, I'm going to do that crap in my organic chemistry class? No. It's about adapting. It's about thinking conceptually. It's about making sure that the needs of our students are met. So just knowing that. Your goal isn't to pick and choose. Your goal is to adjust, to think, to transform, to translate. Okay. A very simple integrative model is called the strands model, and it works basically like this. You've got your distributional features, but instead of just being, here are all the social science classes you can take, there are 200 of them, or here are all the mathematics and science courses you can take, there are 300 of them. All of the courses in the Gen Ed curriculum are themed under 3 or 4 structures that the community as a whole has decided address relevant problems or questions in the world that we live in today. So the 3 I've got up here are nature, technology, purposeful life, globalization, but you could also have well-being, ethics, climate change. You could have AI. And then what happens is as students take a social science class under well-being, and then they take it under the natural sciences, they get to have a sense of, well, this field thinks about it this way, and this field thinks about it this way, and it's interesting. There's overlap here, but also there's this contradiction here. What am I going to do with that contradiction? And working through that process, being able to negotiate whether you call it a labyrinth or a Venn diagram, having that skill in their head is what helps them move into the world, face ambiguity and a lack of clarity, and respond to it. But you could also do something like this, where students come in and they say, you know what I really care about is globalization. I'm wondering about my slides because I adjusted that. I guess I'm using a different computer, sorry. So you have like a mini major. They pick the theme that's relevant to them, and that's what they go with. And that increases motivation on their part, intrinsic motivation. Another thing that happens, though, is that periodically with your themes, you're going to want to change them because the world is changing. So this model allows you as a campus to be adaptable. You're not stuck with the curriculum, the massive curriculum that you voted into place in 2004. Now we need to change it 20 years later. You can just revisit the themes and say, are these still what we want? You can invite students into that conversation. You can invite new faculty into that conversation, faculty who weren't here when it was voted on, so the curriculum becomes theirs as well. Another model, I'm not crazy about this one, but I'll put it out there. First year seminars that introduce students to the fact that there's different ways of thinking in different disciplines, and here's why those different ways of thinking can be valuable regardless of what major you have. And then you go into distribution courses, and hopefully they're integrative so the students are not just taking the disciplinary courses, but they're thinking about them. And then there's some sort of capstone project that asks students to synthesize, to take all the learning that they had both in Gen Ed and maybe even in their majors and put them together to address some complex problem that we're facing in the world. So the integration occurs, but there's a strong distributional feature. Distributive competencies, old Gen Ed says, here's this stuff, this is what we begin with, the what. Competency-based approaches say, begin with the why. Here are the competencies we think are really important for being in the world today. Critical and creative problem solving, global competencies, social justice, analysis, interpretation, ability to respond to AI. Then you have your distributive components, but rather than social science just covering social justice, some social science classes do, some don't. Some social science classes have a strong analysis and interpretation. Everyone in sociology in the room is nodding their head right now, obviously. So it works more like this. As a consequence of this model, what happens is in order to prepare the courses, in order to design the courses, in order to make sure that the courses are being effective, even after, like, when you have your assessment data collected, you need to bring people from different disciplines into the room together. UNO is big, I know, but small enough that that could become your superpower, your ability to talk across disciplinary lines, as opposed to huge institutions that can't. Everybody is so big, they are locked into their college. If you all can communicate with each other, that makes the students' paths better. It makes your lives more engaging, your thinking more creative. All right. Clemson University, while we're talking about larger universities, they begin their curriculum with global challenges courses. Complex challenges defined by the UN, and that is where the curriculum begins. Think about the messaging to students. It's not about the things you take, it's about these big, complex problems. This is what you're learning your very first year, and then every course you take, think about how it comes back to those big problems. Wagner College on Staten Island, 30 years ago, they had 40% first year to second year attrition, and they were basically a regional liberal arts campus. And then they put in this model that had 3 learning communities. Students were in a learning community their first year, their fourth year, and somewhere in between they could choose. A learning community was where, Paul teaches artistic responses to science and technology. Chris Buckles in psychology teaches technology and neuroscience. And my friend Gil Dunn teaches sociology and the impacts of technology on interactions. And so there are 3 different classes, and the same students are taking all 3 of those classes, the same time, the same semester, which means they have this experience, again, of seeing how different fields approach these questions, and their brains get used to the idea that it's not about take the content in and regurgitate it on the test. It's about take the content in and translate how that content works in a situation I haven't seen before. It's a different way of thinking and a different way of entering the world. All of the learning communities have an experiential component. Wagner College is on Staten Island. They looked up and said, hey, New York City, maybe we could use that to our advantage. Sorry, I shouldn't make fun of them. Sorry. The distribution components are there. I mean, if you go onto their website, you will actually see these distribution components first. But they're not where things end, all right? And they went from a situation where they were regional and losing 40% of students a year to the point where they were retaining so many students. They now had a national reputation. We're drawing students from all over the country. And so they were able to increase like the leaves and the number of leaves that faculty were able to take. Drury University in Springfield, Missouri. Students are all required to take 2 interdisciplinary learning communities that are asynchronous. So they had 4 courses they needed to take. They didn't take them all at once like the technology one I was talking about earlier. They could take them at different times, different semesters. The final one of those was a capstone, a mini capstone, that synthesis thing where they would take the 3 courses they'd had before and they would try to address some problem by pulling things together, pulling the strands together. Certificates were based under life or profession. Those 2 areas. Every certificate had to fit there. They had to be interdisciplinary. They had to not be offered as majors, minors, or concentrations. They were completely different. So there would be topics like ethical leadership, graphic storytelling, interactive design, data analytics. The beauty of this is that a student comes in and they see the gen ed requirements and it's just this thing that they need to do. A student comes in and they say they need a certificate in life and they need a certificate in work. They understand why that's valuable. Yes, I'm studying engineering, so having some things that are going to make my life better or my interactions with culture better are important. Yes, I'm studying English, but it might be nice to have some data analytics skills that could come in handy, that could make me a better candidate on the job market. Groningen University in the Netherlands, 3-year university system. Every year they take a problem-based course or a project-based course. These are collaborative. The first year, the professor comes in and says, here's a problem, here's the methodologies, here's how we're going to find the solutions. Second year, the professor comes in and goes, here's a problem, you know the methodologies, I'm going to work with you to find the solutions. Third year, the professor comes in and goes, you pick the problem, you pick the methodologies, I'm going to be here as your coach and your guide on the side. So students encounter the complexity and the interdisciplinarity of the world from the start, and then they increasingly improve their skills to tackle those. All right, so those are the macro structures, the institutional structures. Start thinking about class structures and design. What happens to our classes? What are the implications of this? Common assumptions. Gen Ed should be 101 courses. It should be broad content coverage. This is the only literature class they're ever going to have, so damn it, I'm going to make sure they get everything in 14 weeks. It's about content delivery. Sometimes it's also an introduction to the major, right? Some questions. Does broad content coverage make for lasting learning? Intro Psych used to have 13 chapters in the Intro Psych books you'd get nationwide. They now have like 19 or 22, okay? The semesters haven't gotten longer, but we've got to cover all that content. Does that actually help the learning? Is our goal the content itself or the ways of thinking? Do major students and gen ed, this is a loaded question. The answer is no. You know, I mean, obviously not. But yet there we do it. And then this, what are the DFWI, the drop, fail, withdrawal, incomplete rates? What are the consequences of what we have on our students? And I will point out that we know that DFWI rates, they disproportionately impact historically and structurally marginalized students. And we know that the more DFWIs you have, the more likely it is that you won't return to college, and the more likely it is you're going to be burdened with college debt despite not having a college degree that will help you pay off that debt. So the consequences for this are huge. Alternatives. A couple years ago, 20 years ago, I was at a conference, and my friend Adrian Bloss, who was in computer science, came up to me and said, you got to talk to this guy named Bob Cape. He's at Austin College, and he has this amazing first-year seminar that the students achieve on just the data is their students are doing amazing work when they come out of that first year seminar. So I tracked down this guy, I bought him coffee, we sat down and talked. And after about 20 minutes of him sort of describing it, I finally said, Bob, I don't get it. This is a basic first year vanilla first year seminar. How are you getting these great results? He said, oh, I've got two golden rules. One is you set the bar for this course at an intellectually high level. It's demanding. It's not just easy peasy, because that's not engaging. Students don't come to college to just breeze through it. They like a breeze course every once in a while, but that's the first rule. Set at high intellectual level. Second rule is then go into my syllabus and cut out 30% of the content so they actually have the time to learn how to, and I can teach them how to achieve those high intellectual goals. Okay? Brian Dewsbury, biology professor at Florida International University, he says when I'm teaching intro biology, I'm teaching more intro than biology. My goal is to have the students in the class, and particularly the students of color, understand how it is to think about being a scientist. To understand that they can be scientists, to be able to see themselves as scientists, right? He and his team have learned through their research that they can cut 40% of the content of the course. And their students will achieve as well or better on the final exam for that course as students in traditionally structured courses, and as well or better 3 and 4 years down the line in terms of GPA. So paying attention to that affective thing, to their sense of their right to be there, to the sense of their own capabilities, all of that has a huge impact on students. So once we think less about, I've got to teach all of this, then it opens up a lot of different ideas, a lot of possibilities. What are the themes that we can work with in our classes? And I will also point out that oftentimes these themes match some of the work that we do in our research, right? And so that can increase our intrinsic motivation. I've got a colleague, Hedley Freak, who used to be at the University of Connecticut. He said, if you give me a choice between teaching Chemistry 101 yet again or Nutrition and Gender in Developing Nations, I'm going to take the second one every time because it intrigues me. And when I walked into the class intrigued, the students are going to be more engaged and they're going to pick the course because they find it interesting. We're all going to have a better time and learning is going to be better. Theme courses allow you to build strands, pathways, mini-minors that we talked about, learning communities, all of that stuff, asynchronous learning communities. All of these things are about allowing students to make meaning, not just I'm taking biology because I have to, or I'm taking art history because I have to, but I'm taking art history because this matters in this way, putting the puzzle pieces together. Integrative approaches, I already talked about this, politics and art versus the physics of music. Integrative, what are the ways in which your field already connects with other fields? And this, by the way, I will point out, this integration, it helps on a neuronal level as well. If you're connecting to prior knowledge of our students, they can take the new content and connect it to other neuronal networks, and it's easier for them to recall and build off of and find meaning. That was your mini lecture from an English professor about neuroscience. I apologize to every single neuroscience and psychologist in the room. Integrative courses, literature can go in a dozen different ways. So can sociology, so can psychology, so can chemistry, so can biology. Team design courses is another way to do integration. Everybody thinks about 2 instructors in the room at once. Every administrator thinks, oh my God, no. There are other options. You can have a large lecture that has multiple professors in it, and then they break off into smaller groups on Wednesday. You can have rotating instructors. I'm not really crazy about this model because it means that the ability to make sense of the 12 different professors who gave me 12 different lectures at 12 different times is purely on the student. But it is an option. And then sometimes you can have team designed and then individually taught courses. A scientist and an art history professor in the room, chemistry and art history, by the way, at the same time designing it, but then they teach separately and they check in with each other. I will also kind of point this out. Thinking about course design, our habit is the intro level courses have 600 students. Those are the students who most need help figuring out how to survive in college. University of Virginia, listen, I grew up in a working class town in Wisconsin. At the University of Virginia, they wear ties to football games. I'm not going to brag about this institution at all in any way ever. I mean, that's just weird to me. But they have this thing that they do where they change their first year courses. Every student takes all of these coming in. They're small classes. They're 7 weeks long. And then they switch to other ones in the second half of the semester. They take 2 per semester. That happens all in the first year. They're topic-based. They encourage intellectual risk, and they are taught by the best professors on campus. This is how you keep students. This is how you make sure your best students are fine and your most struggling students are fine. Integrative assignment. So we talked about the macro level, then we talked about the course level. I'm going to hit the assignment level. Finally, what it comes down to is this. You can have the best designed gen ed curriculum in the world. It can look beautiful. Your administrators can go to those administrator conferences in like Tahiti or wherever they go and brag about their great thing. But if what students are doing in the classroom is exactly the same as what they've done in the old curriculum or what they've always done, nothing is going to change. So it comes down to that micro detail. What are we asking students to do? What kind of discussions are we having? So you could have a paper assignment where students in a gen ed literature class are asked to explain to business majors why literature matters. Or students in a gen ed business class can be asked to explain to literature majors why business matters, why it's important. So take it from one area and translate it to another, that active translation. Any class, answer one of these 2 questions. What might your studies in your major add to learning in this class? This is where I got the paper on Coleridge, Oley, and Harp and string theory in physics. The student takes their expertise and brings it into the class and helps me understand it. What did you learn in this class might be useful in major? The student takes what they learned in this class and they bring it back to their major. Now with this one, it's possible they might not think anything they learned in this class is valuable to their major, but that's not the assignment I asked them to do. I asked them to step into the possibility and to think about it. If imagining another reality or how other people think is the worst thing I ask my students to do, that's okay. What did you learn in this class that matters? Explain your answer, citing and analyzing 3 text concepts from the course. I do this in every course I teach, whether it's literature or writing or the teaching of writing. Some of the answers I've gotten are amazing, unbelievable, things I never would have thought about. Everything from, I learned that it's not the what that matters, it's the why. I learned that I'm depressed and I need to do something about it. I learned that when my mother was dying of cancer and I was not interacting with her emotionally, that made perfect sense. I learned that I don't want to be a proof rock. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, the guy goes through the world emotionally numb. I learned that I don't want to do that in my life. So just profound answers. All of these questions, those can also be used as discussion questions in the class. So here's this material that we brought in, this theory by Weber in sociology. Talk about how, why does this matter to you? And not just what is Weber saying, but why does it matter to you? Or how do you connect it? Or how would you translate it? Or how would you make this make sense to your 12-year-old son? Or your 12-year-old son, sure. Or 12-year-old brother. Or reading prep questions. Or even sometimes, the beginning of class. Walk into class and rather than beginning with the lecture right away, say something like, I want you to take 5 minutes, think about the reading that you did or the video that you watched in the flip course, and just jot some notes. Why do you think this matters to your other classes or to other fields or to your major? Let's talk about that. You can do that even in a large lecture, by the way. Many of these could be exam questions. I'm going to skip this on multiple choice. We can come back to this if we want. Thinking about Gen Ed broadly, this is key. Always keep in mind your aspirations for your students. It's so easy for us to say, I'm teaching this, I want to make sure I cover this, and this. The question really is, when students graduate from University of Nebraska, Omaha, what kind of student do we want to go into the world? What do we want them to be like? How do we want them to interact with the world? What skills do we want them to have that we think are direly needed? Keep in mind that very few complex skills can be developed in a single contextualized course. So if we're talking about writing or mathematics, but also things like synthesis, there is no inoculation. You can't turn around and say, well, you covered this in your math class 3 years ago, so I expect you to, no, okay? We don't expect someone who took a French class their first year to be able to speak fluent French their senior year. We can't expect someone without having worked with it in the intervening years. We can't expect that in mathematics, we can't expect that in writing, we can't expect that with synthesis and integration. Those are complex skills. They need time and repeated practice. Finally, Gen Ed courses provide an opportunity for strong pedagogy. Just keep that point I made just a moment ago in mind. If students are doing exactly the same thing in the class that they were doing with the old Gen Ed curriculum, if you're doing exactly the same thing in the class that you were doing with the old Gen Ed curriculum, either you were very forward-leaning or yeah, a little bit of conversation needs to happen here. So, okay, I apologize for the length of that. I know we have a panel discussion as well. Thank you so much. Do we want to take questions at this point? Okay, take a few questions. I don't want to cut into the panel too much, though, but yes, please. Thoughts, concerns, ideas, yes? Yeah, that's a wonderfully complex question. I can guarantee you right now I'm going to give an unsatisfying answer, but I'm happy to continue the conversation. So part of it has to do with sort of the goals of education. Part of it, as I hear it, has to do with serving two different populations in our courses and making sure, and definitely as a person who comes in and is talking about Gen Ed, part of my goal is to make sure that in your courses that your introductory level courses or the courses that serve the Gen Ed curriculum, that the Gen Ed students and the Gen Ed goals are being taken care of, being attended to. Your point, though, is that it's also, if I understand you, is also important to make sure that the field advances as well. I mean, in the field of chemistry, given some of the global challenges that we're facing, we want students who can work in chemistry in productive ways in order to make things better. Is that fair?
Yeah, and just that, I think, so context, I'm in the physics department.
Oh, sure.
We teach stuff that's 200 years old.
Yeah.
You're going to teach the stuff that
Yeah.
we just learned 20 years ago.
Yeah. An interesting thing happened during the pandemic. I was at a small liberal arts institution that had so much money that they could have run for 100 years without charging any tuition. And yet they did. They had enough money that they could hire professors who were not only great in research, but also excellent in the classroom. And what I saw happen when the pandemic hit, they'd never taught an online course in their lives. They never offered one. The pandemic hit, and suddenly all these people had to make adjustments. What I saw some of the best professors do, and I'm thinking about a professor in economics in particular, he's like, listen, I've got these 13 chapters, but what I've really got are 5 key concepts that when a person is thinking in economic ways, if they can get those key concepts, even when they encounter information that they haven't seen before, either existing information within the field or new information as the field and the world evolves, they can respond to it in a way that has integrity for our field. So part of it is our tendency is to focus on the surface level content. But I think what's really key are those key conceptual skills. So that same university, and I'm not naming them for a reason, the biology department has brought their learning outcomes down to 3 things, these 3 things. It doesn't matter how you teach a biology course, it doesn't matter what the content of the biology course is, as long as those students are getting those conceptual skills that will allow them to then respond to the world thinking in these terms, we're going to be okay. Part of it, the way that knowledge is being produced and the way that thinking is evolving right now is happening so fast that, for us to think that we can cover everything a student needs to know within our field, we would need not only all 120 credits towards graduation, but probably another 60. It's just content is being produced that quickly. So it's not just how do we prepare them for the world as it is, but how do we prepare them for the things we can't anticipate. I do want to give the panel time. I'm tired of hearing my own voice. I don't know about the rest of you. So.
One more question.
Okay, sure. One more question. Yes, please. God, I don't know. I wish you could tell me. I'm at a pre-health sciences college. And no. And what happens is 60% of our students come in wanting to be doctors. And it's not because they're suited to be doctors or because doctor would be the most fulfilling profession for them. It's because they don't know any other language. Doctors, nurses, PAs, that's all they have. Part of it is language is only going to get us so far. I mean, if we've got 18 years of developed neuronal networks based on experience of what is valuable in the world and what is possible in the world, we can't give them a 5-minute lecture that's going to change their mind, okay? We can't even give them a 1-hour lecture that's going to change their mind. We need to think about what experiences can we create for them that they're going to suddenly go, oh, public health, I didn't know what that is, but now that I see how public health works in terms of environmental health, I actually find that really interesting. So can we, in our introductory level courses within the major, that's why I love create experiences. That's why I love that University of Groningen. I'm not going to try to say it with a Dutch inflection. I love that. They have this wicked complex problem and they spend all semester working on that. And then what that allows them to do is experience the way that every problem really is interdisciplinary and recognizing that if I want to, in the case of my students, if I want to help patients, there's not 3 ways to do that, there's 100 ways to do that. So how do we create an experience to counter the limited experience and the limited understanding that they've had before? And that doesn't mean that the admissions literature, that the way the tour happens can't help, but let's think about orientation, right? Can we have them break into teams? And can you bring in a UNO alumnus in and say, you know, I work in athletic wear. Here's a problem that we encounter all the time. You've got 1 week to solve it in your teams. And you've got some faculty, or some RAs, or some graduate students working with you to sort of help that. And what experiences can we create? So, by the way, that example is what they do at Savannah College of Art and Design. Nike comes in and says, help us design this shoe. And these art students who are attuned to nothing but art suddenly realize how poetry comes into play, how business management comes into play, how culture comes into play in ways that they hadn't before.
So, thanks, Connie. So one of the questions that I really have that I've struggled with through this kind of gen ed revision process, and you've kind of seen threads of this come out in the conversation today, is, you know, I think Paul and others have emphasized this need for students to really tackle complex, challenging problems that don't have clear answers. However, how do we balance that breadth that's just inherently required for that kind of an experience with some of that depth of content that we either have typically had in our courses or that we think is essential for that follow-on kind of experience in another disciplinary course? And so maybe we'll just start a little bit with Derek. And how you maybe kind of address that kind of a challenge in terms of what you do or what you've seen done in the past.
All right. Derek Nero, College of Education, Health and Human Sciences, Teacher Education Department. Some years back, the university had set some priorities, and one of the priorities was STEM education, and how would the university, as well as throughout the community, UNO address STEM communication. And I was asked, given that wicked problem, like, hey, go figure this out. And one of the things that came to mind was giving students an experience in STEM. And part of it is that we have to be able to define our area. I know one thing I challenge our students, our teacher education students, is that when your student asks you, why do I have to take this? If you can't answer that question, you need to go back to the drawing board. And I thought about, well, how could I present something to our students from a general ed standpoint that would have them ask the question, how can I ever use this, but through the course experience how they could ever use this. So the solution for me to address the wicked problem of how do we engage students in STEM education was let's have them create near space experiments and launch them on high altitude balloons. So everybody was like, whoa, what? And I'm like, yeah, that's it. Give them something challenging, something that most likely they've never done before, but through the experience of learning how to create a near space experiment and how to launch it on a high altitude balloon, they will learn different types of skills and content areas that they would need not only just to get through this class, but that would apply to other courses as well. So the title of the course itself is Science Experimentation and Engineering Design. And that's exactly what happens in that class. They experiment, they research science, they engineer these near space experiments so that they can launch them on these high altitude balloons. I ask students to suspend their disbelief. I saw that in one of the points up there, like, don't get caught up in what you think you know, what you don't believe you know. Let's just experience this together. It's a general education course. Students I've had the philosophy students, I've had the music students, I've had education students, across the board, engineering students, and they all come in on the exact same level. They don't know what the hell they're getting into. And that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. They're in college. They're here to learn. And how can we help them learn? How can we help them have an experience? And the majority of what they learn on their own as well as with their team. I'm not teaching any particular content. Okay, I'm guiding them, I'm helping them along the way. They have to justify what they've learned. They have to justify how this will support their experiments that they're creating. They have to show how their engineering will actually make that organism, which we just sent up some starfish, we just sent up some earthworms, how we're not gonna kill them. They're gonna come back alive. So there's a lot of components that goes into it. And I always ask the students at the very end, was this the coolest class you ever took? Because I tell them that on the first day. I say, this is going to be the coolest class you ever take. And they all say yes, but it's from the experience. And they learn things and they get to apply it in other courses. And I've had a colleague tell me, I could tell what students took your class when they get to them. And so I encourage everybody to like challenge yourself with these wicked problems. A lot of what was talked about, it does seem a little like that's outside of my realm, but I ask you all, why would your students need to learn what you're teaching? All right, and there's a whole bunch of things out there that what you teach applies to. So take that large, huge idea and whittle it down to what the students will need to learn from you in order to get to that point of being able to address that question or that wicked problem.
I don't know why you even brought me in. Would have been shorter if you had just done that whole thing.
So I'll just add one thing. So I was very fortunate once to get to go to the student presentations for Derek's course, and I had no idea really what to expect. And I went and sat in there, and I believe that the experiment had something to do with like Velveeta cheese getting launched up to whatever 100,000 feet. And what was so great about it was not necessarily what students were learning about Velveeta cheese, but like what they were learning about that scientific process, the good things, the bad things, the challenges. It's not always clean, and they actually were very, very proud of themselves. I mean, you could just see it come through in their presentation. So, I think they definitely had a great experience. So, Melanie, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I want to piggyback a little bit on what Derek said about kind of experiential learning and application, but I think I come at it from a little bit different way. My background is in languages, and so oftentimes we think about this as a skills-based class, right? We're building on linguistic skills so students can achieve more and more. And so you never want to be the person that is, somebody's teaching Spanish 2 and they're like, oh, who did you have for Spanish 1? Oh, well, we had Bloom. Oh, well, there you go. So you don't want to be that person, right? Because you didn't get them where they needed to be. But to Paul's earlier point as well, you don't want to cram so much content down their throat that they don't have time to reflect and build, and in my field, really importantly, apply. And in languages, probably the most important is real-world interaction, right? So you have to have those opportunities to interact in ways that are meaningful for students. So at the beginning of the semester, I would always ask my Spanish 1 students, like, okay, why are you taking this class? Usually, it's a gen ed requirement. I have to. I said, okay, but what do you want to do now that you're here? And that's the more important question, right? Because that gets you to how we can apply what you're learning to something that matters to you. And oftentimes you get those stories of, well, my grandma actually speaks Spanish and she has limited English proficiency, and so I want to communicate with my grandma. But the person, if you just asked them, why are you here, they'd say, well, it's Spanish 1 and I'm taking it for gen ed. So you learn those personal things, and that gets you a clue about how you can help these students apply those skills that they're learning to their personal lives, but also building, assignments and assessment. I think Paul talks a lot about in his book about how to create meaningful assessments for students where they're tackling these kind of wicked problems through application. But you can also do that obviously through service learning experiences or other experiential learning, which I've done a lot in my own classes, is trying to get students outside of the classroom and applying those skills in real world contexts or tackling real world problems that matter.
Amy?
Is it on? No, just turn it off as usual. Okay. I happen to be in one of those disciplines that is just by nature, like Victorian literature, very multidisciplinary. So I'm always able to pull in other fields. I think I haven't taught in a number of years traditional art history courses, but one of the ways that I made art history experiential was taking students abroad. And I have to say that I haven't instituted some of the innovative assignments and so on, but there is something about, so when we go to London and we go to the National Gallery, I don't have the connections to put them in front of somebody who can move a Rembrandt or do a technical analysis on it in front of us. but getting them there, and I was telling someone right before this started that students who study abroad are always my students who seem to go into grad school, stay in the field, and I can't tell if it's the chicken or the egg. Were they already students who were going to do that, or were they, or did it change their lives just being there? But I'm excited to think about different things. I actually had the opportunity to study in Groningen, and that you mentioned.
You can do it.
I can do it. I took Dutch for a year. We need Christina here, though. She's native. But one of the things I had, which I would love to model more classes on, was this thing called the knowledge of the curator. Because for art historians, one of the things you do is create an exhibition. And so a bunch of people from all over the world were there, and they presented lectures on things that were very current in the field, like, is fashion in art museums? Is that where it belongs? And if you have an indigenous art exhibition, how are you going to hang things that actually had a functional purpose? So we had some lectures, but then at the end, we all had to create an exhibition, and we were put in teams, and we kind of had to compete with one another on how the exhibition design would work out. And we had no concept of the different artists we were looking at. We were all from different areas of art history. Anyway, but that was something that profoundly changed my life and would be very helpful if I had ever made it into a class here. But there's always next year. And so I think, again, having these experiential learning and study abroad has been really helpful and impactful for students.
All right, thanks. Paul, do you have anything to add, or is?
A note that in those last two responses, there was a mention of community engaged learning and study abroad, both of which are high impact practices as defined by George Koo. and there are 11 of those, and part of there's a couple things that make them successful and meaningful. One is that they're dealing with uncertainty, being in a foreign country, trying to negotiate the country, dealing with a community. I can learn the book, I can learn the content, I can memorize the content, I can hand it back to you, and I can get an A, and then I can go in the community and suddenly have to apply it, and it becomes very complicated. So I think one of the things I keep thinking, I'm going to think for the rest of, I've got a 5-hour drive tonight home, I'm going to be dwelling on that question the whole time, is because if our students think it ends with the content mastery, then they are only going to get so far. Except for those students who know it doesn't end with the content mastery, and they're going to be fine. And if I have a situation where some of the students are going to be fine and 90% of the students are going to stop here, then I don't have an equitable classroom, and it worries me. So what can I do? What experiences can we curate? Yeah.
So is it okay if I ask one more question, and then I'll turn it over to you all? If not, just stand up and ask a question. But so one of the things that I'm thinking about here is like doing these kinds of things, for example, that Derek's talking about, right? That requires of students to be willing to step out of their comfort zone, right? To be willing to take a risk, to be willing to do something that's maybe a little bit uncomfortable. And so what are some ideas about things that you can do in the classroom to make that okay to do, right? To encourage students to do that, and it's going to be okay, right? You're diving into something that's unfamiliar. It's not going to lead to an F if you don't get it right away, right? So what do you do for them?
You have to prepare them. Like, we don't launch the experiments until like week 11 or week 12 of the semester. And every week prior to that, everything goes towards the next week. The next week, there's no busy work. There's no, you did that just for a grade. Everything works for the next thing. So there's a lot of reflection. Each week, they're writing about their learning and what that means to them. They're learning about their understanding of the content that they're learning. There's teamwork in the class. They do team and self-evaluations where they have to be reflective of how they're interacting with one another and how they're learning from one another. But the skills that they need to be able to create their near space experiments, they're given that. They're given opportunities to fail before the actual thing. It's not just the day of and now all of a sudden they're doing it. So preparation, and that's what we all need in life. I mean, that's why we're in college. That's why they're getting education. We're preparing them for their professions, future professions. So each and every week is another step along that ladder, or rung, I should say, kind of scaffold to prepare them for what they have to do ultimately?
I would say two things. And a couple of weeks ago, I gave a presentation on a panel with a couple of my colleagues from World Languages, and we talked about the importance of risk-taking as a faculty member, as the instructor, and in showing your students that you don't always have it under control, and that you're willing to try new things that you'd never tried before, in which you may not be the expert. So I'll give a personal example. So one year I did a course called Latin American Literature Through Performance. I'm not a literature professor, so that's a challenge for me. I also have no idea about performance, but what we did through that class was the goal was at the end of the semester, we put on a play for a 4th grade dual language class at Spring Lake Elementary. So this was completely outside of my realm, completely threw myself out there. I acted in the play with the students. We did theater games, all of stuff that I was super uncomfortable doing, but demonstrated to my students that I'm out here with you, one, as a partner in crime, a collaborator, but two, problems came up, as in all service learning projects, problems come up. And then we figure out how to solve those problems together, because I don't know the answer. You guys don't know the answer. So we got to figure out collaboratively how to solve these issues that come up. So that's one, is just by risk-taking as an instructor. And then two, giving your students responsibility in the classroom. My research is on teaching and learning. And for about 20 years, I've been talking about the importance of tension in the classroom, because if there's no tension, there's no learning. You have to have tension, just like in a good book. If there's no tension, there's no plot, there's no climax, it's not a good book. So in the classroom, you have to have tension, which means students have to get a little uncomfortable. If students are comfortable, there's probably no learning happening. They're looking at those rote tests, they're memorizing things, et cetera, right? So give them assignments or even class activities which they have to take responsibility for parts of the learning. And there's different ways to do that depending on what your disciplinary area is. I've heard a lot of faculty talking about how students don't read anything anymore. Well, how are you preparing them so that they have to read, so they have responsibility for something once they come into the classroom? So I've done things called literature circles in my classes, where students, when they get to the class, they have a responsibility during that class period for that piece that they read or for those chapters that they read. And there's peer pressure because they're working with groups of students, There's a lot more pressure there than there is if it's just the instructor asking questions to the class, that they have to take that responsibility, and there's something actively happening within the class period. So those would be the two things: is creating that tension, that risk taking, and also increased responsibility.
Don't have a lot to add. I think, again, mainly in an administrative role now, I think about a lot of the faculty members and how daunting it is for them to think about this. So I guess my question is, how do we support faculty to do experimental items like this? I mean, is it just watching you be willing to do it, Melanie, or is anybody else doing that wholesale? Or how do we provide support? And I can see, like reading Paul's book, thinking of, oh, I like these ideas, but I would need more examples than the ones Paul gave, because I'm a very Virgo and I need very concrete ideas. And how do you get someone to go sit in on somebody else who's done this? And how do we provide support for faculty? So anyways, now I've just kind of flipped that.
Great question. Paul, anything you want to add on either of those thoughts or comments?
I mean, I have thoughts on that last question. And I think you already pointed to some of them. I mean, how can we create conversations? How can we create opportunity to step in each other's classes in a non-threatening way?
Yeah.
How can we, when we talk about risk, we talk about, you mentioned getting rid of the grade, making sure they don't fail, giving opportunities to, the equivalent for us is our teaching evaluations. How can we reduce the weight of the teaching evaluation as the coin that determines how effective our teaching is, because it's not the thing that determines how effective our teaching is. So what other things can we put in place to diminish the impact of that?
Yeah.
How can we create conversations? How can we create spaces where faculty are able to feel vulnerable?
Because I can see what you did where you really took a risk. When you think of more experimental, students can say, like, if you were like, let's make our own content for a couple of weeks, and they're like, she's not structured, she's not organized, I didn't have the layout of each class period. So, and again, that goes back to teaching evaluations, because I feel like those are the kind of things you say when you try to teach in a more innovative manner.
And gender plays a role, and size plays a role, and our voice, where our voice is pitched, plays a role. All that comes into play. Institutional support. It begins with both the language and the structures and the practices related to how a person gets tenure and promotion and or contract renewal. And I think putting language explicit into that talks about innovation, that talks about risk, that talks about the complexity of the world that our students are going to enter. On the language level, on the practice level, I mean, and I want to be a little careful. I've been at my new institution for 15 months, but I've never met an institution like it. It has the advantage of being 15 years old, so it's a startup and it was built differently. You will see language explicitly in the tenure and promotion guidelines, but also on the annual evaluations that diminishes the relevance of teaching evaluations. It's there, it matters, we need to know the experience that the students are having, but we've got built in, everybody needs to be observed by the institutional head, that's me. Everybody needs to be observed by their peers. Observation should be not just one way, it should be a dialogue, so that I'm coming into your class not just to tell you whether you're good or bad, but to see what I can learn about my own teaching and to understand about it. What are the language, what are the practices? I mean, there's such a complicated question, right? Because in these politicized moments, but I also know that, I'm zooming in for a talk in Norway on Wednesday, and I'm like, why can't they fly me out? I mean, I really, but I know in Norway the practice is oftentimes you can't teach anything that isn't on the syllabus. So the syllabus is handed out, it's got all the readings, the students don't even have to show up for class. They can not attend once, but as long as they read everything on the syllabus, then they can show up for the final exam and take that, and if they pass the exam, they're fine. Anything that goes beyond that content, though, the idea that there's applications or intricacies or that we can read not just with a text but against a text, or read or respond not just with a theory but against a theory, or complicated nuance, all of that disappears. I think that's the wrong way to go, and I don't think that prepares people. I mean, that's transactional, that's a rubber stamp.
Thanks, Paul. All right, so I would love to talk for another hour and a half. I'm not sure if Paul would enjoy that, but
I would.
I do want to thank everyone for your attendance today. Maybe another hand for Paul and the entire panel. Great job.
You all are unbelievably good. Yeah.
Before I let you go, though, I just also want to emphasize that what's happening in Gen Ed, as I think is very clear from the conversation today, is less about a set of requirements, although that's very important, but it's about this kind of a conversation that's ongoing, it's sustainable, it's long-term. And so I just want to thank you all for being on this journey at the beginning, and we will continue as we move forward. So just want to thank everyone for being here, and have a great rest of your afternoon.